He's one of the last great defenders of the Constitution in the Congress. He's the father of the modern-day liberty movement and the so-called godfather of the Tea Party movement. And he's just announced he won't be seeking re-election for his seat in the House of Representatives. Instead, it's the White House or home. Here now, Texas Republican Congressman and Republican presidential candidate Ron Paul. Congressman Paul, it's a pleasure. Welcome back to Freedom Watch.
Thank you, Judge. Good to be with you again.
Was this an easy decision or a difficult one for you to decide not to run for Congress after representing your district for 24 years?
Well, actually, not too difficult because, I was never, I don't think I was cut out to be into politics. I sort of won by accident. So when I was here for 4 terms early on, I was anxious to go home and go back to medicine. So I've been sort of pushing hard to hang around and do my best. So, but I think the thing that convinced me was having 2 campaigns at once. I did that 4 years ago, and I think it deserves some criticism. I think you should only run for one thing. So I'm doing it this time, but I'm also concluding that, one way or the other, I'm not going to stay in the House of Representatives.
Does this mean that if you do not get the Republican nomination for president, you are now free to run as a third-party candidate, challenging the big government instincts of the Republicans and the Democrats?
You would think that the laws should permit you to do that, but some have indicated to me that that is not necessarily so, that some states precluded that if you sign on and become a Republican candidate, then the law says you can't become an independent. I have not looked into that, mainly because I haven't been thinking along those lines. But I think it would be a shame if that were illegal, that you couldn't do that. Matter of fact, I've complained a whole lot about our system in this country. I detest the idea that we send young men overseas into countries and they die imposing democracy on these other countries. At the same time, the democratic process here in this country has a lot of shortcomings. As most people know, that I tried it in the Libertarian Party, and I spent more than half the money just trying to get on the ballots, and you don't have credibility, you don't get in the debates. So the democratic process is very hindered here, and guess what? The laws are written by Republicans and Democrats,
right.
And if anybody comes to the conclusion that sometimes those 2 parties don't change policies at all, that they endorse same policies, then you see why we get into this trouble and this endless spending and endless debt. Nobody challenges the Federal Reserve, and the foreign policies remain the same.
Today, Senator Mitch McConnell, who's the leader of the Republicans in the Senate, proposed one of the oddest pieces of legislation I've ever heard of, which basically would allow the president to go out and borrow money, and the only way he could be stopped would be if 2/3 of both houses of Congress voted to stop him. Yet again, Congress giving away its constitutional power to the president. If you and I were going to write a letter to John Boehner telling him why he should oppose that, what would you advise me to say in that letter?
I'd say, haven't you read the Constitution? Read it. This is not to be done. We should not support it. It's outrageous, and I can't even conceive of anybody considering this move.
I understand that earlier today also you had a confrontation with someone who's probably glad that you'll be leaving Washington unless you stay as the President of the United States, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve. Did he actually say under oath that gold is not money? Did he actually make that public statement and expect people to believe it?
No, he wasn't under oath. He was under, ethical conditions where you're not supposed to lie to the Congress and you're supposed to always obey the Constitution. But evidently that part of the Constitution is going to be ignored as well, because the best I can tell, gold and silver still is legal tender. And I also understand that the Federal Reserve note these pieces of paper have never been technically and under the Constitution be made legal tender. But no, he told me flat out. I said, is gold money? And he said no. And I asked him why central banks hold it, and he said, well, that's just a tradition that they do that, and that they have to hold some assets. So it was a rather interesting conversation. But yeah, he was very blunt and said that gold is not money.
Well, this former Princeton economics professor is either ignorant of Economics 101, which he once taught, ignorant of the Constitution, which he took an oath to uphold, or is not being candid with you, even though the government is prosecuting Roger Clemens a couple of blocks from where you are now for not being candid to another congressional committee. I mean, is there a different standard for members of the government when they testify than for private individuals like Roger Clemens?
Well, what about the private individual that used gold and silver coins, and he did it out in the open, and they called him a counterfeiter and a terrorist suspect and put him in prison? What did he get, 28 months or something? And all he was doing was his best, interpretation of the Constitution. Let me tell you, he was a lot closer to the Constitution than our Federal Reserve Board chairman is.
Congressman Hall, keep up the good fight, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Judge.